So as we transition to more of the westward mobility and settlement aspect of our industrialization unit, we're going to be examining different business opportunities that presented themselves, and they kind of went along with this large-scale movement. Like many industries, mining out west began small. And we already saw this with the California gold rush. Individuals headed west with a shovel, pickaxe, and mining pen. Soon, some pulled their resources together for more success. And this would eventually give way to professional companies and engineers with hydraulic pumps. And eventually, lode mining became the order of the day, where you use dynamite and rock crushers. Now, California was one of the first to experience this phenomenon, but the silver mines of the Comstock lode, which you see pointed out here, they soon provided a rival to California's claim to precious metals. Now, gold was discovered in Colorado in the late 1850s, and this influx of settlers explains the buildup to the Sand Creek Massacre. Gold and silver were found in Idaho in the early 1860s, and copper was found in Montana and Arizona. And closer to our neck of the woods, portions of northern Wisconsin were found to have rich iron deposits. And that's why many of the highways and the sand beaches amongst northern Wisconsin are red. Once a particular metal was viewed to be tapped out of a region, the region emptied and ghost towns were left in their wake. The ghost town you see on screen is Calico, silver mining town that was in the Mojave Desert. Had about 500 mines at its height, and the boom lasted about 20 years. This is a place that was hurt by the Silver Purchase Act, which drove down the prices of silver. No economic reason to be there. People are going to empty out. That's just how it is. So mining was pretty heavy industry. Now, logging not only drew settlers out to the far northwest, but was also prominent here in Wisconsin. And in the 1830s, logging wasn't really too popular, as most operations were small scale and they occurred out of either Green Bay, Portage, or Prairie du Chien. So Green Bay, that's where the Fox River flows from. All right, the Fox River connects to the Wisconsin River in the city of Portage. And then from Portage, the Wisconsin River empties out into the Mississippi, and that's where Prairie du Chien is. So these were very strategic locations. As the 1800s wore on, logging developed as a major industry due to the large number of rivers cutting through the state and the ample supplies of timber that dotted the North Woods. The Menominee were really the first to develop a highly successful logging operation that remains to this day, and this is due to their use of the Menominee River for transport of the logs, which this cuts straight through their reservation, and their insistence on sustaining their resource. Once the Menominee had met their personal quota for a calendar year, buyers can either get on a waiting list or they can go someplace else. And the Wisconsin River, which cuts through the center of the state and then it diverts southwest once it reaches what's now the city of Portage, the Wisconsin River provided an avenue for transportation that connected the forests and the early settlements. So land around the river was clear-cut, the logs were placed in the river to be transported to the mills, and once in the mills, large saws cut them into boards. This is how Wausau and Stevens Point developed into cities, and there are other places around Wisconsin, like Peshtigo, that developed in this manner. Once railroads came into use, logging could be a year-round operation instead of relying solely on the weather, because traditionally, loggers made camp in the winter to cut down trees and spent the spring driving them down the river to the mill towns. 1/4 of all Wisconsinites were involved in logging at the turn of the 20th century. And however, logging companies became victims of their own success, and they did try and focus on saving the resource, but not before some of them moved to the Pacific Northwest. And what we mean by saving the resource is local companies like International Paper and Kimberly-Clark did employ foresters to work on conserving their timber, And with this shift, as some decided to go to the Pacific Northwest, some stuck around, former lumber towns became mill towns, and the Northwoods as we know it would only recover once the forests grew back following World War II and tourism began to boom. So you have mining, and specifically here in Wisconsin, you have the prevalence of logging as a major industry. Cattle actually came to the Americas at the same time as the horse, and this was with the Spanish, and cattle escaped at about the same time as horses escaped the Spanish. They grazed into what's now the United States in the early 1800s. Now the problem with the Texas Longhorn was when they were in the east, the ticks would fall off of them and infect the other cattle. However, it was accidentally discovered that in a frost, these ticks would fall off as well, so they were held in a northern range during a frost. This toughness translated to other areas of the Longhorn's life. They could subsist on tough foods, they were undaunted by predators, and they could roam for miles to find water, and they'd still return home. Now, before the Civil War, Americans were mainly pork eaters. But the Civil War called for an additional supply of protein. And after the war, workers and immigrants will flood into the cities, so they're going to need sustenance. The issue becomes how to get the cattle from their grazing lands in Texas and Middle America to these markets in the east. Now, livestock were already traveling east on trains, but the issue was that thousands of them needed to be transported on the railroads. There was also the issue of driving these cattle from Texas to the railroads, and many of them were concentrated in Chicago. Once in Chicago, they could go to the market. Entrepreneur James McCoy had the idea of making Kansas the crossroads of the cattle drives. If the cattle could be driven to a railroad town in Kansas instead of all the way to Chicago, it would alleviate the journey and it would traverse through fewer farmlands. So McCoy went to Junction City, where he was turned down. He also spoke to the presidents of the Kansas Pacific and Missouri Pacific Railroads, but they thought he was nuts. He then arrived in Abilene, which you see on the map here. All right, he made it to Abilene, just west of Junction City. And in Abilene, there were fewer people, so it boasted large grasslands for cattle that were awaiting transport that could graze it. And Abilene was already on the railroad. The first season of these long drives saw 35,000 cattle board rail cars bound for Chicago slaughterhouses or other eastern cities. So it and other railroad towns like Dodge City became natural endpoints for these long drives. Now, getting cattle to Abilene was a challenge, and Charles Goodnight was one of the pioneers of these long drives. His reputation as a Texas Ranger allowed him to recruit the best hands for the job, and a typical drive would consist of about 3,000 cattle. The best hands earned $5 a day, and in a trip that translates to thousands of dollars. And they were in the saddles from dawn until dusk to deal with anything that would occur. And some of the dangers included rivers that needed to be crossed, there could be snakes, there was bad weather, but really the most dangerous was a stampede. Goodnight stated that the first 10 days were critical, and if you controlled the herd at that point, the rest of the journey could be fairly straightforward. All right, that was the way that he viewed it. Cowboys also formed their own culture of using a lasso, living on very simple food. They would sing to one another around a fire, and they'd fight one another. And really, this era of the cowboy only lasted about a decade. Once the railroads reached Texas, as you see here, once they reached Texas, the long drives were obsolete. Now, what you see up above are black cowboys, which there were a fair number of black and Hispanic cowboys. But the romanticism The mythology of the cowboy comes to us through Buffalo Bill Cody. He rode on the Pony Express, served in the Union Army during the Civil War, and his Wild West show toured Europe and America in the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s. So they perpetuated this romantic myth. Black Elk, the Lakota Sioux, was actually hired in the early stages of the show, and this was how he was able to tour Europe. So in addition to mining and logging, cattle, driving cattle, trying to utilize the cowboys to get your cattle to the markets becomes big business. Now at first, there were no disputes over grazing practices because there was an abundance of available open land. As more settlers arrived, the land was overused and overgrazed. Now, there were some cowboys who accrued enough wealth to become large landowners themselves. And we have the example of William Perryman, who tended to his father's land and was told that he could keep every third calf for himself. He ended up with about 25,000 acres, and he only cultivated 1 to 2 of them for himself. The rest was left for his 25,000 plus cattle to graze. And again, since this Texas Longhorn is resistant to cold weather, they became the prime choice for prospective ranchers looking to acquire land in the Dakotas, like a future president named Teddy Roosevelt. These cattle ranchers sometimes came into conflict with the sheep herders because sheep eat the crops close to the ground and use up the land quicker than the cattle. With the land out west that was supposedly public domain, we also see a phenomenon called the tragedy of the commons, where it's not my land, so I'm not going to take care of it. If property is private, people tend to cultivate it more, take care of it more. If it's public, people use it however they want. And this is what happened with a lot of these grazing lands. So the natural evolution, as it were, of settlement and agriculture, where you fuse agriculture, industrialization, and capitalism, would be the Bonanza Farms. And these are plots of land that can be as little as a couple thousand acres and as much as 70,000 acres. And these were designed for the sole purpose of cultivating wheat. The most impressive of these Bonanza Farms were found in the Red River Valley of North Dakota. And in addition to their size, they stood out because the tools of labor replaced muscle with machine power. The harvesters and threshers were driven by steam, and the plow was really the smallest tool to be found on these operations. Now, like most industries, they were subject to market forces worldwide, and by the end of the 1800s, the cost of operations was too much to turn a profit. So most Bonanza farms were converted into smaller farms, although some still exist today. It does serve as the prime example of how entrepreneurs sought to duplicate the success of Eastern industry over in the West.